To you all. My name is Jan Stone. I'm from William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a reference librarian in the Warren E. Berger Library. It was named after one of our most famous alumni, the penultimate Chief Justice of the United States. We're here today to talk about video conferencing, which is one of the high-tech features in many schools. And I'm just curious to know how many of you have video conferencing equipment in your schools? Okay. How many of you have worked with that video conferencing equipment? All right, most of you have. And how many of you don't have it in your school, but you have either been involved at some other site or are thinking about getting it for your school? Okay. So most of you have some kind of direct interest in that, and that's good. Most of the sessions I've seen here so far this conference have been pretty formal, which surprised me a little bit. I would like to invite you to participate more in this conference, this session of the conference, and that's partly because I'm pretty new to video conferencing also, and I'm not an expert in anything that I can think about, and I think one of the things that we could all benefit from is if you can share some of your experience, because you may have some answers that we haven't run across yet, and what I have, as you'll find out later on, is mostly questions. Okay, so this session is probably going to be one of the least technical that you've seen at the conference so far. The session that's really going to be fun is the one that's after this, in this room, right after lunch in this room. They're going to do a live video conference demonstration, and I would invite you to attend that, especially if you aren't familiar with the technology, and even if you are, to see what they're doing better. During this session, we'll mostly be talking about two different things, and one is, who are some of the people involved? Who are the people behind the scenes in a video conferencing setup? And secondly, what are some of the issues? What are some of those details that the devil hides in? At the end of this session, after I've raised a number of the issues that I will raise, you're probably going to think, oh my gosh, this is just way too much. Is it really worth it? And lest at any time you think that I don't think it's worth it, please know that my answer is absolutely it's worth it. It just needs a little bit of organization, that's all. 3 years ago, Henry Parrott, who's the dean of Chicago Law School, Chicago-Kent Law School, spoke to this conference in a plenary session, and he talked about video conferencing and its impact on both law school education and law school economics. And I think most of us would probably agree with him when he said that video and audio will be a part of teaching, lest we look like a cheap product. Well, any of you who have worked with video conferencing know that video conferencing equipment and its operation is not in and of itself a cheap product, although it's a lot better than it was a few years ago, and it's continuing to get better. I do think, however, that with a little bit of cooperative planning and some goodwill of forethought, we can prevent making video conferencing an unnecessarily expensive part of a student's law school education product. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, in the description of this workshop, I used the analogy of the theater. Maybe that's just because I come from an area where we have probably more theater per capita than any other area in the country. New York has a lot of theater, but they also have a lot more people. So per capita, we rank. And I see a lot of theater. And it occurs to me that there are some good parallels. In good theater, they have two purposes. One is to communicate, and one is to energize minds. Kind of sounds a lot like law school teaching. So I've used that analogy. I will mix metaphors, I'll stretch metaphors, and for most of the most of the hour will probably just drop the analogy altogether. Forgive me for this, but it's a starting place. So we'll begin. And where do we begin? We begin with the stage. Was it Touchstone in As You Like It that does a speech on all the world's a stage? That's from Shakespeare, right? Okay, well, he tells us all the world's a stage, and I thought, this is Shakespeare. It's like 400 years old. I'm a reference librarian. I know that you have to update information. So I did a little bit of current awareness work when I was on a plane last month. And as part of that current awareness work, I pulled out one of the masterpieces of current awareness information, the magazine from the seat in front of me, and opened it to a column called Plugged In, where I read, "These days, meetings are a way of life. It pays to search out new and better ways to be productive with presentations for groups sitting either in your conference room or half a world away." Well, video conferencing is how you get that half a world away. We're going to talk mostly about what it looks like in the classroom today. And we just need to keep in mind that what it looks like in the classroom may at some point need to translate to what our students can do with this in the future. So maybe we're giving them that initial experience. The cast we're all probably familiar with. These are the people you can see. The professor, the students. Okay, those are the people that they'll be dealing with in the later session. And I'm going to try not to stray into those areas, even though I have some observations and opinions in those areas, probably more than I do on what I'm talking about. Catch me if I stray, please, because I don't want to steal Wayne and Brian's thunder. But now we're going to talk about the people that you don't usually see, the others in the production. I started out thinking that maybe I could recommend some kind of a structure for this, and I realized each school is different. You have people in different positions. You have different position titles. People have different functions, and so it's pretty hard for a person at one school to make any kind of prescription for people at another school to deal with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the people that I identified in my own school that in some way either affected the video conferencing or were affected by the video conferencing. And after we go through this list, and it's a fairly long list, I will invite you to think of other people maybe at your own school that might be also involved in this. Where do we start? Well, of course, we start with the dean. He or she is the person who probably signs that contract with the video conference vendor. Now, beyond that, most of them don't have a great deal of involvement unless there are problems. And some of you are fortunate enough to have systems that operate pretty much without problems. We had a few challenges this year. And that's probably why I got to talk to so many of these people. There's the vice dean, or maybe it's a dean for academic affairs or a dean for some other title who's in charge of deciding what courses will be offered and how the classes will run and what will be required of the classes. Then we have the people who watch the budget and say what bills get paid and find money to pay the others. The registrar gets involved, usually quite involuntarily. These people don't like to go anywhere near this because it can create problems that they can see, but often the person planning the classes doesn't, because the vice dean doesn't very often get the students in his office, you know, complaining about, well, how come it starts at 10 minutes after the hour and do I have to leave my other class early and that sort of thing. The registrar gets those kinds of headaches. The conference planner at your school, if your school does any kind of conferences, CLEs, anything of that sort, that person should be aware of what the limits of your equipment are, what it can do, what it can't do, and when it's available. The outside academic contact, if you have one, the person who maybe is the first person to take an inquiry from another school, should know about this, because if somebody calls to ask about the possibility of video conferencing, they shouldn't be left saying, "What's that?" The receiving agent, the purchasing department, others, the building supervisor. Now, this is, even if you're not in the midst of construction, the building supervisor may have to be involved because maybe there are HVAC issues. If you have a vent that sounds like a train roaring overhead that goes on at 17 minutes after the hour all the time, then that person may need to know and try to do something about that, because it can really mess up a teleconference signal. Another problem is that often the lighting that is good in a regular classroom is not good for video conferencing. Any of you who have done any work with tech theater at all know that you balance like the yellows and the pinks and the blues so that you get people that look like people and not flat images. Well, sometimes you have to work a little harder to convince the building supervisor that, no, we aren't going to think that your people are, don't know what they're doing if they put blue and pink lights in this room. And you have to convince them that that too is a part of aesthetics, is being able to send a good signal, not just having the lights look pretty up on the top. I always think that if they have meetings in that room and people are staring at the lights, there must be something wrong with the meeting anyway. So, the house electrician may have to be called in. There may be wiring issues. The maintenance staff, particularly if you don't have a dedicated room for video conferencing, the maintenance staff is a key element. And they may need to be educated on why the tables have to be set at a certain crazy angle in order to get students visible onto the camera. They may need to know about other issues. For example, if they're asked to be the people who build the cabinet to put the equipment in, they may need to know how that works in order to do a good job at that. The room scheduler, again, particularly if you don't have a dedicated room for video conferencing, the room scheduler needs to be aware of the fact that the room has to be set up for video conferencing. If you have a room with movable furniture and you're running, say, a board meeting up until 10 o'clock and you have a 10 o'clock class, it's just not going to work, because you have to be in there at a certain amount of time beforehand to shift the furniture around, to set the microphones, to dial up the other sites. And, as I'm going through this, most of these are kind of no-brainer issues, but they're the sorts of things that I've discovered other departments don't necessarily think about. I've compiled some of these lists by talking to a number of different people from these different areas, and so I'm just kind of sharing their thoughts with you. Who else needs to know about this? The faculty administrative assistant is involved, especially if it's a class being run from your school, because they need to know how to distribute the information that they usually distribute to the students at your school. They need to know, they may be involved when the finals are given, depending on what form the final takes. Library circulation and reference staff. When we have a professor at our own school that's teaching a class, we try to make sure that we know where relevant materials are for that class. Well, at remote sites, the sites that don't have the professor on hand, somebody should be alerted to the fact that, these are some materials that might be helpful for the students taking this class. Maybe professor will even need to put some readings on reserve, and that's why you need to have the library staff involved in the video conferencing. You also need a contact, both for the remote students and for the professor at the remote sites. And there are a number of reasons for this, and I think you'll see them as we get into talking about some of the issues. Now, this is the last of my list, but I want to tell you that I didn't leave this part of the list for last because it was less important. These are key people, and oddly enough, sometimes they aren't involved at the point, through no fault of their own, at the point where they really should be involved. IT and audiovisual staff are key when you're selecting a vendor, when you're selecting equipment. Again, it seems like a no-brainer to you, but believe it or not, there are administrative staff that still aren't aware that these things have to happen. The webmaster can be an extremely important person to keep involved in what's going on with your class, too. If you are the home site and you want a web page put up, then the webmaster can be of assistance there. But the other thing is, if you're running a video conference class and using any information on a web page at all, you have to keep in contact with this webmaster, because otherwise they may, like our school did, we redesigned our web page, and I think a lot of schools have over the last couple of years redesigned web pages. Well, whether it comes down for a couple weeks or whether it just glitches for a while can be a real problem. We had a class that was a remote site, and the home site, the home video conference site, redesigned their web pages just about the time that the third major assignment was due in the class. The professor put the information up on the web page, assuming that all the students could get to it. Their web page was down. Students were panicked because they couldn't get the information that they needed in order to do their assignment. So it's real important to keep in contact with your webmaster. Now, this is the end of my list, and I guess I'd be interested in knowing, are there other people that you can think of that whose lives are touched by this, or whose work influences anyway what you need to do in video conferencing? Anyone think of someone else? Yes?
Or using the equipment. We don't do a blanket teaching session on how to use video conferencing.
Okay. You've done just a session with all of the faculty on how to use it?
We have one faculty member who's taught a course.
Okay.
I taught in Indonesia, environmental law class with Vermont this past semester. So that's
video conference with Burma?
With Indonesia.
Oh, Vermont. Oh, okay. Well, it's close. You can see it from there. Yeah. Did you find that it worked better to have faculty as a group trained, or to do one-on-one with them?
Small group.
Small group. Okay. Okay. Sometimes they don't like to be trained in groups. That's why I was kind of curious to know. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a part of the presentation with Brian and Wayne this afternoon. I'm doing this segment, lighting and sound. But how we handle it at Columbia is we just had the faculty walk in, after the backstage. I also treat it like a theatrical presentation.
Good.
We're the behind the scenes crew and the faculty. I deal with the faculty on getting a bullet outline of what they're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I get it from just from the standpoint of what kind of speaker they are. Are they a roamer? Are they just a sit and look at the camera sort of person?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of doing, if he's a roamer, then you have audio and blocking problems. If he's a sitter downer, then you just point the camera at him and end the story. The more the faculty gets involved, the better off. I mean, we kind of do the tech stuff behind the scenes and have him walk into it, proscenium,
right.
Where you are, kind of thing. We've taught a full class from Mexico to New York City, and we've taught an administrative law class between Washington and New York. We've taught UCLA to New York. Very different contexts. Physics class, they used our facility, whereas the teacher actually did all this stuff on the board, and there was a full class in front of him, and there was 2 other remote sites on the other side. So, with the variety, many times the law faculty have to think about law. They don't want to think about lighting. They don't want to think about roaming. They don't want to think about notes. So I really have to press them for an outline of what are they going to do, where are they going to go. and that kind of thing. But it's another context whereas I mean your involvement, you know, from the top down is great, because then you have the dean buying into it, and you have the housing crew buying into housekeeping crew, so everybody's involved. It's a great context.
Yeah, everyone is involved, whether they realize it or not. But what happens often is, you remember that story about the 5 blind people who encountered the elephant? And one of them happens to walk up to the leg and thinks it's just like a tree, and the other one's got it by the tail and says, oh no, it's a snake. You know, just like a snake, and, you know, the other. Well, what happens often is each of these people does have a piece of it. They may not understand their own piece entirely. And they may know that there are a couple other people involved, and they may think that they understand those people's issues with it, but probably don't. And what happens when you have all these people, and I counted up, I've identified about 19 different people on here. What happens is you get something that's a little bit worse than management by committee. And we know some of the problems with management by committee, but you get a lot of duplication of efforts sometimes if you don't know something has been covered. Either something gets left undone because you thought somebody else was going to take care of it and they didn't even know that it needed taken care of, or you're stepping on somebody's toes. I was really fortunate in the work that I did with video conferencing that, well, the person whose toes I stepped on a couple of times was blunt enough to come and tell me so, you know, and I could handle that. But if you have personality conflicts over issues like that, it really magnifies some of the problems. And in the meantime, you've also got a lot of confused vendors out there, because they need to contact you, somebody at the school, about something, and they don't know who to call, or the person they think they should call is not available to take a call because, you know, it happens to be maybe the tech person who's out troubleshooting other classrooms. Yeah.
You know, looking for the bottom line and buying the cheapest piece of equipment because.
Yep. Well, and that's a good point. People also don't understand the importance of some of the issues. During the second semester, we were the home site for a video conference class, and we had 20 students on site and 1 microphone. Well, you know, you're not going to pick up any sound. So early on, we put in an order for a setup that would allow us to use more microphones that would be compatible with our system. And the order went in, but it sat for a while on somebody's desk that had to approve the purchase, and I'm not sure exactly where that was. Now, that's understandable. That person is in charge of watching the budget. That person doesn't understand that every day people are not able to participate in class, or people at the remote sites can't hear what our students say. And so when people at the remote sites can't hear what our students say, you know, they don't want to comment because they don't want to be caught in the position of saying what somebody just said. So, you know, there was not the immediacy at the level where that order got stuck, and then finally the professor has to get involved and go in and say, you know, we need this equipment now.
Rental funds are, you know, easier money?
I am not sure on that. That's not one of the questions that I asked. I hadn't thought about it, but yeah.
Where the law school is right on Broadway, so I mean, I have access to the rental agencies.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
What
That
did you rent?
Shotgun mics or mixers or long cable runs. Like we had a long period of time when we were refurbishing sections of the building, so we had to get the signal to other parts of the building. So it really, but I just passed the money on to the class or the group that's sponsoring the event, so it's not cash.
So this was an outside people using your facility?
No, it was internal law school group, but I mean, they have to realize, it was in the pre-production in the site survey that we talked to them about that, you know, we have XYZ for facility, but what you want to do, we're going to need ABC, and that's, you know, so I mean, wireless.
So for short-term
diversity systems, that kind of thing. My approach will be more technical, whereas your approach is more
right.
organizational. Yeah.
Right. And you're the person that's going to keep me on track and out of your turf, right? Okay. Okay, actually you brought up earlier an issue that kind of gets into some of the course and class issues, and that's what we're going to go into now. I have a very long list of these. Some of them I will flip through faster because some of them sound duplicative, but they come from different angles. You need to think about why you're offering this class, and the reason I was interested in what you said is that you video conferenced an administrative law class, which we usually think of as one of those that every law school offers. You need to think about, do we want to do video conferencing because we have a particular expert at our school and we'd like to make sure that other schools have the benefit of his expertise and maybe just market him a little bit and make your school look a little bit better? Or is there expertise at another school that you want to take advantage of? Do you have too small an enrollment in a particular subject to justify hiring even an adjunct to teach that class? Or maybe it's just that you want to give your students some experience with the technology. They're going to be out there, for example, in many of the immigration hearings now, they're done by teleconference, good or bad. That's what happens. You need to give your students maybe that experience of talking to a plasma screen. What other issues? Who are you going to make this class available to? How are you going to market it? Will you, put something in the ABA journal, or will you just notify certain other schools that this is available? What information are you going to provide to the students at your own site, and what information are you going to send out to other sites? School calendar. I tell you, this is just a major hassle, and you don't always think about these things ahead of time. Some schools may start as much as 2-3 weeks different time to other schools. Ending time tends to be about like that too. What do you tell your students? Do you tell them, this is the calendar and you're going to stick with it? What kind of allowances do you make for breaks? I think Murphy must have a special law for education that if there are 3 schools involved in a video conference, no 2 of them will share the same spring break week. And so what do? Do you tell your students, I'm sorry, I don't care if you do have break, you got to come in and participate in this video conference? In some cases for holidays, students, the buildings at student schools are locked to students. And what do? How do you work that out? And I don't know that there is necessarily a good solution for that, but it is an issue that somebody at the different schools should be dealing with ahead of time. Yes, sir.
Friend, that with Vermont, they had different spring break than us this time. And the instructor actually did the VHS tapes and sent them down to the students, and they watched them for that week. Okay. So it is
videotaping.
Like a 2-week period there where there was no class really.
Yeah, videotaping is an option. Some of that depends on how much interactivity you want and what the basis of the grade is for the class too. Then if you videotape, then you've got the question of, and here's where one of the places where I mentioned you need a contact at the remote sites for students. Who do you send the videotape to? We were ended up sending everything to a technical person in one of the schools we dealt with, and he finally said, enough already. This isn't my job. Gave me direct email address to the student that they had from their school. In addition to that, there are class meeting times. Are you dealing with schools in different time zones? And this can be a real hassle. If there's a really good class that you want to offer at 9 o'clock in the morning and you're in Boston, but you really want to pick up some students from Seattle, think about it. People down in California probably haven't even thought about setting their alarm clocks yet at that time. So what about class hours? Does your class begin 10 minutes after the hour, and at all of the other schools, classes start at quarter after the hour or straight up on the hour? These can be issues because if students are trying to schedule 2 classes together, do they leave your class early? Do they come to your class late? What happens? And then in some cases, there's a different focus on day students, night students. William Mitchell started out as basically a night school. Now at this point, more than half of our students are in a fairly traditional day program. But we still have on some of these, and particularly this happened with the class that we offered last fall. It was a class that was of interest to a number of night students. But the class was offered right around noon hour. So we had many students that were trying to extend a lunch hour from the regular jobs to come to watch this, to participate in this class. Many of those students really had very busy lives in the fall. It was kind of ironic. The class that was taught was a telecommunications class. We had 7 students on site, and I think at least 6 of them, if not all 7, worked somehow in the telecommunications industry. We had one student that missed class 4 times, and it was because she was representing her own telephone company at public utilities hearings. So you need to look at, what kinds of classes are you offering and what's the possible population for those classes. What kinds of limits are you going to put on the size of the class, whether it's a home site class or a remote class? And this may have a lot to do with the room configuration you have, with the kinds of screens. I'm guessing that in the next session you'll probably get a chance to see realistically how many people you can really see well on a particular screen. What kind of interactivity do you want involved here? Again, this goes to the issue of videotaping classes. Well, if you videotape it, there's obviously no interactivity. And at some point, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis and decide, is it really cheaper for us to have an adjunct here, even if we've got a small class? Are you going to have different DropAdd policies? There's a lot of expense and a lot of hassle involved in setting up a video conference class. Are they going to need more than a note from mom to drop the class? Now, at this point, we have no different policies, and part of that is because students register and drop online. So there's no reasons given, and the deadline isn't any different for video conference classes. Do you need to establish an absolute minimum number of students? And if so, what happens if after 2 weeks you've gone below that minimum? Do you keep running the class or do you not? They're just issues you kind of need to deal with ahead of time so your students know what's going on. And then there are the accreditation standards from the American Bar Association. Those of you who were in here yesterday heard Kevin discuss those somewhat. One of the questions I have is, when they talk about interactivity, should video conference even be judged by the same kinds of distance education standards as, for example, an online course? But those are some things to think about and maybe push the Bar Association on. In your course description, what information do you give? Do you let the students know, what the schedule is going to be, assuming that you've got 3 different schools involved and 3 different class schedules? What's the basis for the grade? Will it be partly on class participation? I think some of those are things that you would put in anyway, but you need to think a little bit ahead of time about, are you going to do it differently because this is a video conference class? What else do you put in the course description? If you're going to be using dedicated courseware like Blackboard or something like that, you need to think about how these students are registering. Andy, is it in our contract with Blackboard? We have one of our IT people here in the room, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Is it in our contract with Blackboard, or could you explain a little bit how it is a student needs to register as a student at our school in order to get access to Blackboard?
Yeah, and from the system, so we need to get them in our system to get them a student ID to create accounts on our end.
Okay. We were trying to use Blackboard with the class that we ran from our home site this year, but the students that were at remote sites had registered as students at their school and not as students at our school. So because they weren't registered as students at our school, they couldn't get into the Blackboard system at our school. And so the professor and his administrative assistant had to do a lot of shuffling around and did far more emailing and things like that than they would have had to do with the Blackboard system. Thank you. If they need to work out issues with IT, they need to have an IT contact and a deadline to do that. You had a comment, sir.
You had access to the web page, your school web page, so that they could, everybody from the different sites could access the web page and put the structure there.
I think because we discovered this after the class began, and because we had just recently redesigned the web page at our school, and it has less access now to the rest of us than before, that wasn't even explored in this situation. But it would be a good way to go, and if you think about it ahead of time, that would be a good way to go probably for future classes. Who writes the description? Do you include information on ABA standards? I don't know who monitors, how many credits people have by distance learning. Since students drop an add in on their own, at this point it hasn't been an issue because we've never offered more than one opportunity probably per semester for distance education. But, what information do you give the students and how do you get it to them? I don't think most of them sit and read the ABA standards. So. Where will the registration be? We already talked about some of those issues. Are you going to charge extra processing fees if students register at the home sites because the registrars need to do some extra communication? Whoops. What do they have? Again, more with fees. Who's going to collect the fees? The home site schools or your school or where they register, or how does that work? Those are issues that need to be worked out preferably ahead of time. And they're details, but they get to be hassles if they're not worked out ahead of time. The instructor payment. How does the instructor get paid? Is he paid as an adjunct from the remote site? Is he just paid by the home site? Do they work out some kind of a deal between the schools? Does he or she get combat pay? Now, there are a lot of these issues that I brought up that if the instructor has to end up dealing with them, it's so much more onerous to teach a class than it is if you can just, pick up your book, walk into class, there's the class, here you are, you talk with them. You don't have to worry about turning on equipment, you don't have to worry about camera angles, you don't have to worry about, blackboard issues, all that kind of stuff. If the equipment goes down and you want to make sure that the students at the remote site know what's going on, you may have to pick up the phone and call them or do extra emailing. There are a lot of things that are put on an instructor in a video conference class, particularly when the equipment may not work well, and any of you know that work with technical issues that sometimes not everything goes right. So, do they get extra pay for that? That's an issue. Where are we to? What are going to be the grading policies? If there's class participation as part of the grade, what happens when the extra sites go down? Maybe you need to think about that ahead of time and make a couple of contingency plans. Class attendance can be an issue. At some schools, I know attendance is not required. At other schools, and I don't know if it's for every class at our school, but there are some classes that if you miss more than a certain number of sessions, your grade drops. Or if you miss a certain number, you can't get credit for the class. What about class curve requirements? Do they differ from school to school? They may not. This becomes an issue when you have final exams that have to be read and turned in at different times. For example, let's say we had a student from one of the remote sites who was hoping to graduate, and her classes ended about 2 weeks before our classes ended. Well, that paper's got to be graded and turned in. It doesn't get to be thrown into the curve, and most professors I know like to turn in all their grades at once. I mean, some of them will, probably not even assign grades. They'll write comments but not even assign grades until they've kind of ranked them within the class. Group projects and presentations can be more of an issue. Somebody that's not responding to your email and that you can't seem to reach even through long-distance phone calls, Maybe at your home site, you might run into them in a class or in the hall. Well, you're not going to run into them if they're 3 states away. What will be your primary means of communication? And that should be clearly established beforehand. And that's where you want to work out and be aware of, Blackboard issues, email, whatever. Reserved readings, you'd think that in this day and age of free access to Westlaw and LexisNexis, this wouldn't be much of an issue, but sometimes it does get to be an issue. And there are times when we have professors that will send hard copy of readings just because it is far less costly to get copyright for hard copy than it is for online readings. The people at the University of Minnesota that deal with online courses say that often the ratio is about 20 to 1. It can cost as much as 20 times as much for online copyrights. PowerPoint presentations. If you're going to use PowerPoint at all in your class, you need to be thinking about the fact that you may have a screen this big that's split 4 ways and the PowerPoint is in 1/4 of that. Well, you need to be able to communicate that some other way so that the students can read what you're talking about. Return of graded papers is another issue and another one of those reasons why you really need a contact at the remote site. In spite of the fact that Microsoft Word allows you to write little notes along the margins in papers, there are teachers that still would rather print it out and handwrite their comments on the papers, and even techno-savvy teachers will do this, and they want to mail it back. Who do they mail it to? At most schools, the students don't have, the student mailboxes are not something that's serviced by the main mail center of the school. So you've got to mail it to somebody that can go down and stuff the student mailboxes. Again, just, none of these are really forehead slappers, but it's just the sort of things that a lot of people don't think about ahead of time. I think we've covered probably most of the, well, textbook. Are you going to have a textbook for the class? And if you are, do you contact the bookstores at the remote site? Who does that? Who makes sure that the textbooks get ordered, or you just leave it up to the students to order on their own? Something needs to be made clear to those students when they register so that they don't walk in the first day of class assuming that they can buy the book in their own bookstore. Exams. Because of the time differences in the class schedules, we had an exam period, a final exam period that ran for about 4 weeks this year. Now, the way we worked this out was that the exam was a take-home exam that would be emailed. The students could sign up ahead of time for when they wanted this emailed. If they requested it to be emailed to them during the regular business hours of the faculty administrative assistant, they could still get anonymity. If they didn't want it during those hours, if they wanted it, for example, on a weekend or at night, they could still get it emailed to them, but they lost their anonymity because they had to have it emailed from the prof. Those are the kinds of issues that you need to work out. And even though we've been dealing with it all semester, we had students that would send in for a time, and even though we clearly asked them, give it to us in Central State Daylight Time, I guess it was by then. We got people that had put in their own time zone time and got their exams an hour later or 2 hours earlier or something than they'd hoped to get them. We dealt with the pending graduation issue. What about the other institutions that you may be cooperating with in video conferencing? It's really important that you're all pretty much on the same page and have pretty much the same commitment technologically on what the equipment can do. If you're running your system off a dedicated T1 line and it requires that, then it gets to be a real hassle if another site doesn't do that. And we started out with our first semester class, and the school that the instructor was teaching from was the last to get a dedicated T1 line. And we had all kinds of problems for about 6 weeks. And finally, when a dedicated T1 line went in, many of those problems were cleared up, but it can be extremely frustrating for an instructor. They walk into class with plan A, and then suddenly there's plan B, and that doesn't work, and then we got to go to plan C, and then come up with plan D on the fly. It's really stressful for an instructor. You need staff to support it at the other sites, and you may need courseware support, even if you have your students registered in as students at the remote site so that they can get into Blackboard or whatever. If your school uses basically WebCT and that's what you're familiar with, then you need somebody on board at the remote sites that understands the courseware that the students are using. Somebody else mentioned this to me about recording sessions. I understand recording for like those breaks and holidays and things like that, but I don't understand why anyone would want to record every session of class. It didn't make sense to me. This is generally an interactive class. Why would you want to record it on a regular basis? But evidently some people think that that's a thing to do. Does that subvert the attendance policy? And what do you do with the recordings once class is over with? Do you re-record? Do you save them for posterity? Or, what do you do with them? All right, that's, I think, pretty much I'm to the end of the course issues. There are times when you may want to use this equipment for a few other things. And I think, whoops, I'd like to just talk about, excuse me, one more. Sometimes professors make site visits. Often it's thought of as a good idea because they have a chance to meet the students at the other sites. You need to work out ahead of time who makes the arrangements, who pays for this. Is there somebody at the remote site that can, see that they get picked up at the airport, get them to the hotel, make sure they get fed while they're there, maybe introduce them to the few of the faculty members, see that they have access to the internet for their email or something like that. There will be special class time issues because if you're running from a remote site that's used to just having a camera set up for students, suddenly you've got an instructor in the room. You have to figure out what to do with that camera. That instructor may also need to teach a class back at its home site, his or her home site, from your remote site, and so you'll need to have somebody set up a point-to-point probably for them to maintain their class schedule. Those are all things that you've got to have. Again, the contact at the remote site would be a helpful thing. Okay, what about non-class transmissions? Sometimes you may want to use this to transmit broadcast or even interactive sessions. We've done faculty colloquia or even conferences. The thing that you want to think about is, there are several things to think about, but do you really want interaction, or is this something that you might be better off just taping and sending to the remote site? Video conferencing is great for interacting, but if really all you want is just to, send the signal, then maybe you don't need to use the video conference equipment. Timing is a real key issue on things like this. If you've got a conference going on the West Coast and they're starting at 6 o'clock and running until 9 o'clock on Friday night, the East Coast is probably not going to be there to see it. And I think the real key out of this one is professional technical expertise. You've got to have somebody on hand during a conference that understands what's going on. I watched two in a row this past fall. They both had excellent speakers. In one of them, somebody had gone in and obviously turned on the equipment, but the camera was at the back of the room. The speaker was like at the front of the room, so the camera was way at the back of the room, so you got this little teeny speaker. You could see the papers of the people in the back row, though. And you could hear their conversations, but you couldn't hear the speaker at the front. So here was somebody on foreign and international law, an expert in the field, up here speaking and saying profound things. And what I was hearing was, and yeah, our plane got in at this time last night, and then we went over to the hotel and we had 3 drinks, and and it went on from there. And that's not the sort of thing you want to transmit. And then for a while, the camera got bumped or something, and it was pointing at a brick wall for about an hour and a half. finally they got a hold of a security guard who really didn't want to listen to him, but they harassed him enough that he went in and pointed the camera in the right direction again. The next weekend, there was a conference that had a technical person present the whole time, and it was set up so well. The speakers were mic'd well. The camera was focused on the speakers and not the papers on the back row. And it was such a treat because the quality of the speakers was, again, good, but probably no better than the speakers the weekend before. But this one was really worth attending. The problem was, this was on a weekend that our entire school was very busy. And there was nobody at our site seeing this except me. So timing can be really important. We have faculty colloquia at our school, and someone got the idea that we should be broadcasting these or video conferencing these, actually. Well, in the past, these have been kind of sit around the faculty lounge, which is kind of like an overgrown living room. And they have lunch brought in, and everybody kind of grabs a plate and sits in various sorts of chairs, kind of around in a circle. And usually one of the faculty will start this off with maybe presenting a paper that they're working on, or an article that they're working on, or some other topic that they've been researching lately. And it gets to be just kind of a very informal and really rich discussion. I love these sessions. Well, they decided we should video conference these because they are so good. In order to video conference them, we needed to move them down to a room where we had 3 rows of tables set up so that they would fit into the camera. Now, I think some of the faculty may have enjoyed the fact that they at least had a table to put their lunch on, but it changed the nature of this discussion, I thought, immensely. And the terrible part about it was we were video conferencing these to California, which it was like, we do ours at noon so they can have lunch, right? This is 10 o'clock in the morning out there. These people are in the middle of classes. There is nobody in California watching this. We also video conferenced it to a place on the East Coast. Now, it's 1 o'clock there. They've just gotten back from lunch, and they're in the middle of their, first hour class for the afternoon. So there's nobody at that site. So what happens is we've got the split screen up there that you can see is obviously blank. And, we've got our faculty in awkward positions to watch this. And you have to ask yourself at some point, is it worth the trade-off? Maybe the timing is just bad. Maybe there's no interest. But find out about it from the other sites so you know what you're dealing with. One of the difficult things too was one time we had a speaker who came in. He was an expert on, was it bioterrorism, I believe it was, and he spoke to our faculty out of this room. And again, you could see these 4 blank screens up there. Now it's kind of like if we have a fringe festival, a theater festival, where there are thousands of different productions in town, and they're often held in small auditoriums. They're often held in rooms where only 10 people can sit. Well, if you're in a room where 10 people can sit and you have 8 chairs filled, it looks like a good audience. But if you put that same performance into the Guthrie Theater, it looks like an abysmal failure. So here we have an expert from another part of the country out there, and he's playing the blank screens. You need to think about, is it really worth video conferencing sometimes? Vendor considerations. Sometimes these are probably pretty much no-brainers. A lot of vendors are fairly new to the business because it's a fairly new business, so you can't completely hold that against them, but do get a list of people that they've dealt with to find out, how has it gone? Can you communicate with these people? Are they providing you what you want? And it's fair to ask them for things like design assistance, particularly if you're building or remodeling a room, for installation help, for training. Ask them about training because some vendors do provide even ongoing training and updating and new things in the equipment. Technical support, of course. What do the vendors like? The vendors very much appreciate having that single contact to start with. Now, they know that sometimes Their engineers are going to have to talk to your technical person if your technical person isn't that contact, but they want one single person that they can contact and know that the message is going to get to whichever one of those 19 people needs to know about it. They also don't appreciate it when, you have some, I don't know, GE microphone or something from 10 years ago that you want to work in the system and it isn't working right. They often deal with other manufacturers just because they know they're getting quality there. And you need to provide them with some people to train. What might a law school contact do? Well, can encourage the use, monitor the contract, and I don't know how to describe this exactly, except that if you have 3 different professors, for example, using the equipment, and there are slight glitches for each one of those people each week, and it only took 3 or 4 minutes to fix it. We got it going again, but it was basically the same glitch. Those 3 may not be talking to each other about it because, after all, it got fixed. We went on with the class. But you need somebody that kind of keeps track of what's going on, how the equipment's working, because the vendors want that equipment to work for you. And if they find out that you've had the same glitch 3 times in a week, they need to know about it. And this person can dream. What other uses could we have for this equipment in our school? And when they dream and communicate those dreams to the vendors, they can help create the future. So you've got 19 different people, at least, working on somehow on video conferencing at your school. And when they all work together, good things can happen. And that's what they used to tell the kids at Children's Theater was theater magic. Any comments, questions, corrections? Yes.
I have 2 comments from earlier that I guess I've just been saving for the end.
Okay.
But when you were speaking about people that you need to know or need to have involved, especially from the technical standpoint, if you're the person that's going to get called on the carpet when it doesn't work.
Yes.
We like to think of law schools as an island most of the time, but this is so heavily network regulated that you really do need to know the network operations people on main campus. You need to know the outside vendors. For us, that's Ameritech and the Indy One switch sites. And if you're on this side of Mississippi going to the other side, you need to know the people in Chicago.
Yeah.
Because it's all going to go through there. 90% of the time when it fails is because it's fallen into the private hands. It's gone through the lines owned by the major phone companies.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to know those switch site people, and you need to know the people monitoring that. I mean, it's usually only one guy needs to know those people. One person involved needs to know who they are. But someone really should, because when those failures occur, that's usually where it's at.
That's a good point. We had a student on the West Coast that because all we were told was a bridge was down. Yeah. I mean, it sounded like, an ice storm or something. Lost 3 weeks of class. And it was because we couldn't make that connection. Actually, our vendor couldn't make that connection. And I don't know if we probably couldn't have gone around them, but that's the kind of important stuff to know. You're right.
And the second thing, really quickly, was that when it comes to recording classes, especially if you're new to this,
mm-hmm.
This is your experimental stage, sometimes recording a class is good because if you get one that really clicks and it's exactly the way you had dreamed it would be, you can use that to push for funding. When people are saying, well, why are we paying this money? You pop that tape in and say, this is a class.
Yeah.
For 3 different law schools across the country, look what we could create here. And it can be good just for publicity's sake for that first few years.
That's a good point. Yeah, I really hadn't thought of that. That is a good point. And we had one instructor who used video conferencing, I thought, really very well, despite the fact that we had a number of glitches. But she had students at different sites working together as a negotiations team, and then they would actually do the negotiations with people from, all of the sites involved, while the rest of the class watched and critiqued. And she had each of them participate at one point or another, but they would break out from class to do some point-to-point for a while they worked on their own side. And it was, it really stretched the use of technology a bit. So, yeah. Thank you for that. That's good thought. Yes?
Two questions. Number one, are you dealing specifically about ISDN-based video conferencing as opposed to IP-based? Because, I mean, Internet 2 is very prolific.
Yeah, it is, and it's wild. I've seen a little bit of what that can do. Yes, I was not dealing with Internet 2. I mean, may we all live long enough to be hooked up to Internet 2, because it can do some wonderful things. But yeah,
I'm not that I use Internet 2 with any frequency, but I'm just saying that the other question was which kind of codecs do you use, and which kind of, I mean, like, do everybody have a Polycom? Does everybody have?
Yeah.
we have
I
Polycom.
find great service with Polycom, and the equipment takes a lot of the headaches out. And we just actually bought a new unit.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Polycom is actually a wedding of the PictureTel, which did a lot of the infrastructure development, and then Polycom just kind of bought it and added to their flavor.
Yeah.
But the facility that we have is able to handle, we have Tambergs in one building, and Polycoms, they handle IP and ISDN in the other building. And I call sites, I mean, people say that if you're using IP, you're really at the mercy of the net. But you'd be surprised how strong the infrastructure has become with fiber being, propagated everywhere. So I wouldn't hesitate at going to an IP-based teleconference, only because, I mean, obviously testing, and this is something I'm going to bring up, is behind-the-scenes testing and practice and training. There's no substitute whatsoever for that. And if you have a conference at 10 o'clock, you don't walk in the room at 9:30. You just don't do it.
Yeah.
You plan, you plan days ahead of time, and in some cases, in your case, Vermont, weeks.
Yeah, because they had the Tenbergs. It was a completely different setup, the way their network was set up than ours, the eye control.
Well, yeah, and Sony's out there, and there's a lot of Sony products and like that. So, I mean, these are all behind-the-scenes stuff that could destroy.
Yeah.
And his point about recording, you should have the tape machine running all the time, even if you throw the tape away, or wipe it. The only reason being is exactly his point, that you're going to
when it happens,
more funding, and even if you can edit this piece later, you can piece this parts, or if you can digitally record it so that it remains high quality, so that when you go to the mountain to get funding sources and money and backers and that kind of thing, you have a theater piece to show them.
Yeah, excellent point.
They don't know this contains pieces of several different events.
Well, and it's like teaching. You never know when you're going to have a good day,
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes?
Just one more quick thing. We use virtually entirely a Polycom system where we're at. And for those worried about whether or not Internet 2 compatibility is going to be an issue, it's actually housed on our campus. Ha 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 ha. So at IUTY, this is where it was built. It's in our library across campus from us, and we have had no problems with connectivity. No more than we had before, at least.
They let you use Internet too to do it now?
Yeah, I can make it in the office.
Yeah, that was great.
Where did you say you're from?
Indianapolis.
Okay, Indianapolis.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone across the pond to London several times, too, and it's like you and I are talking here.
Yeah. No 3-second delay.
No.
Yeah, we enjoyed hearing the late laughs from one of the sites. Did you have a comment also? Oh, okay. Well, you are all free to go, you realize. Yeah, I'm not holding you here, but thank you for sharing your thoughts with me, because I've learned something too.